Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to thank you for taking time to follow this short lecture on research methodology, which will present to you the structure of the research proposal so that you can start working on your research proposals. I'm going to use a specimen research proposal, which is a research proposal of a student that graduated last year. It will guide you in terms of the sections that we expect you to capture in your research proposals. Without wasting much of time, I'm going to go straight to my presentation. As you can see on the screen that I've just shared with you, the research proposal has got quite a number of sections. The most prominent one is the cover page, which introduces us to the research proposal. So for each and every one of you as my supervisees, I expect you to have a standard cover page, so to speak. And this cover page must not be numbered. If you check, you realize that the cover page is not numbered, but then again, the entirety of this research proposal is actually not numbered. But before I send out this specimen in an email, I'm going to make sure that from page 2 up to the last page, the proposal will be numbered, the specimen research proposal. It's only the cover page which won't be numbered. So it's only the cover page which won't be actually numbered. So the research proposal has got quite a number of sections. There are about 12 or so sections, though some sections are broken down into quite a number of subsections. So we start with the introduction of the research proposal. And basically, when you are looking at the introduction of the research proposal, there are basically two main ways in which you can introduce the research proposal. The first way of introducing the research proposal is to introduce your reader or readers or your supervisor to the subject matter that you want to investigate as a student, which obviously will be related to a research topic. When we look at this specimen, you realize that the research topic that this particular student was investigating or doing, it was the role of commercial banks in the agricultural growth and development in Zimbabwe, So if you look at the introduction, it centers on agricultural issues, and it is quite evidence-based. And we normally encourage students to have a brief introduction, because having a lengthy introduction actually encroaches into the next section, which is the background to the start. So we normally encourage students to be very brief when they're introducing the subject matter of whatever they intend to investigate. So basically, to give us a feel of the main things that we are going to be looking at, for you to give us balanced information on what you are going to be covering, it means the student would have done preliminary literature review. So you can't do you can't start writing your research proposal without doing a background search on the subject matter that you're investigating. And this background search of the subject matter that you're investigating it's akin to literature review, but it's not literature review proper, because you can only learn the facts and figures, the factual information about the phenomenon that you're investigating when you read the relevant extant literature or existing literature on the subject matter that you're investigating. it is only from an informed perspective that you can begin to outline the issues or the parameters that encapsulate the topic that you are investigating as a student. So as you can see, this introduction is basically 2 paragraphs. But if you look at most of my writings, you realize that the introduction to my chapter 1, for instance, for the PhD thesis, even for the master's one, which is not published online, the introduction is just a brief 1 paragraph. But if you feel there are other issues that were not covered in the first paragraph, you can have a second paragraph. But to overlap to a third paragraph and then have an introduction which is covering an entire page, it will be doing disservice to the background, to the start. In most cases, you realize that you'll be encroaching on the background to the start section, which is the section that I'm going to go to. So that's the first way in which you can introduce your research proposal. You introduce it by, just covering the basic issues that are covered in your research topic or that are captured by your research topic or that impinge on your research topic as informed by the theoretical and the empirical literature that you would have read in preparation for your study. So that's the first strategy. The second strategy, which is rather a hybrid strategy, is that in the first paragraph, you outline the main areas of the research proposal itself. For instance, you'll say this research proposal comprises of the introduction to the study, the background to the study, the statement of the problem, research objectives, research questions, hypotheses of the study, assumptions of the study, limitations of the study, scope of the study, justification of the study, brief literature review, and the brief research methodology section. And then after doing that, merely introducing us to a research proposal by telling us the main structure or the main components of the research proposal does not really introduce us to the subject matter. Still, you will need to have, some lines where you cover the subject matter as well. So you realize that the first method of introducing the subject matter is actually superior to just capturing the main areas of your research proposal, which is the descriptive introduction to your research proposal. So let us assume you start by introducing us, which is the first method, introducing us to the subject matter of your investigation or of your research topic. At the end of either the second paragraph or that first paragraph, still you have to capture the main components of your research proposal. The person who is reading your research proposal must be prepared to anticipate the sections that are coming in the research proposal. In other words, at a certain point, you have to capture the layout of your research proposal. I mean, as a budding researcher or as a researcher doing, your degree at graduation year stage, or at part 4 stage. So if you start by introducing the subject matter, you dwell on the subject matter quite a bit up to the second paragraph. It means at the end of the second paragraph, where my icon is flicking there, you have to have a sentence or two where you are capturing the main areas of your research proposal to sort of summarize to us what the research proposal as a document actually covers, so that we can anticipate the forthcoming sections of the research proposal. Or alternatively, you can use the second strategy of actually describing the research proposal in the opening sentence under writing your subheading 1.0, which is the introduction. You say this research proposal comprises of, or this proposed study, which is captured in this document, encompasses, then you list the main sections of the research proposal. And because that is not enough, again, you have to move on to the main issues that are tackled in your research topic, as informed by the theoretical and the empirical literature. And then next you move on to the background, to the start. You realize that in this specimen, the background to the start was actually poorly done. Why am I saying it was poorly done? I'm saying it was poorly done because it's largely speculative. As you can see, there is no reference to either theoretical literature or to secondary literature. We expect a student who has done, the background search of the literature to actually quote literature in the background to the start. During the course of this, my supervision of you up to, say, next week on Friday, I'm going to send you various specimen research proposals so that you can see the do's and the don'ts that are associated with the research proposal writing. Writing a research proposal like this, where a student is writing like someone is writing an essay in the examination, is not accepted, because research is not based on sentiment. Research is not based on personal opinion. Research is not based on the opinion of friends. Research is not based on hearsay. Research is based on evidence. It must flow from evidence. Granted, you and I, we may have strong opinions on certain issues that are prevailing out there, either in the theoretical world or in the practical world. But those, strong opinions, they must be anchored on the literature, on the extant literature, what we call the extant literature. The extant literature is the existing body of knowledge. So this background to the start, whatever issues are raised here, the student was supposed to support whatever they are writing as background information to the start with the literature. They were supposed to cite authors at the end of text or at the beginning of the sentence, saying, according to Ndlovu reveals that the agricultural sector is intimately connected to Ndlovu. 2016 reveals that the agricultural sector is intimately connected to the banking sector, and it has been so from antiquity. This is corroborated by other authors, such as by Hadebe, Dlamini, Vimisai, and so, and then you are just citing the years. And then you move on to another issue, dissect another issue, also anchoring on the literature, and the background to the start must be properly paragraphed. It must be properly paragraphed. The paragraphs, it should not comprise of one paragraph like what we see here. It should be properly paragraphed. Again, just like any section, just like any normal self-contained section, it must either have an introductory sentence or one or two sentences that introduces it, which captures the main issues that are covered in the background to the start. And then the background to the start can also have tables and figures. A table, I take it you know what a table is, because it's there in Microsoft Word, how you craft a table. It's generally a drawn feature which comprises of rows and columns, where you label the first row according to the column names. The first row cells are labeled according to the what? To the column names. And then the cells of the first column, they can also be labeled either likewise, or they can be labeled with actual information which falls under the first column, and so on. So with the table, what we do, ladies and gentlemen, is that the title of the table appears on top and the source appears underneath. The title of the table appears where? On top. And it is in bold. And the title of the table, if you are doing a table, let us assume you are doing a table. You say table 1.1, if it is the first table, colon, research proposal. Let us assume it's a table which is actually summarizing research proposal items. And then next, you insert your tab. You insert your tab. You insert your tab. Maybe it has got 2 columns and 2 rows. It's just a simple tab. Maybe here it is section, item. And then underneath, you unbold. Section 1.0, it is the what? The introduction. The introduction, you unbold that. You unbold that. And then next, you go to 1.1. It is background to the start. I'm just illustrating how you can do your table because I don't have a ready-made table here. 1.2, it is the problem statement or the statement of the problem. It is the statement of the problem. And then you go on like that and so on. And then underneath, you just skip a mini line and then you write source. Source, Ndlovu, 2021. If you saw this table in a document which was authored by Ndlovu in 2021, you don't write the author initials, you just write the surname. If it is the World Bank, for instance, you can write the World Bank 2019, if the document was published in 2019. But I want you to note that the title of the table is bold, it's on top, and the source is also bold underneath. So this is how you label a table. Please take note that because when you have finished your research project, you are going to transform this research proposal into a chapter 1. Everything in the research proposal is prefixed with a 1 when you are section labeling it. So the tables and figures, they start with a 1 point something. And then when you are in the literature review, which is your chapter 2, you start with table 2 point something. And then figure 2 point something, that's chapter 2. Chapter 3, table 3 point something, because you are now in chapter 3. Figure 3 point something. Chapter 4, which is for data analysis and results presentation and discussion of results, it's table 4 point something, figure 4 point something. Usually in chapter 5, there are no tables because you are concluding the start. Let us assume there is a very compelling reason for you to have a table and a figure. Though reasons they may not exist because we don't expect you to be presenting anything. But let us just assume for academic reasons or for argument's sake, there is a table that you feel you need to present in chapter 5. It will be table 5 point something, figure 5 point something, like that. So we don't label tables, table 1, 2, 3, 4, like laymen in the streets. Our work is organized. We label according to the chapter or the component of the research project where the table or the figure appears. That's that on the table. To make my life easy, let us assume you are not dealing with a table. Let me just delete this tab. Let us assume you are not dealing with a tab, but instead you are dealing with a figure, for instance. A figure, maybe it's just a diagram, insert a picture. I'm trying to load some images from the internet, which can assist us. Maybe this image of carrots. I'm trying to download it and load it as a figure to illustrate how you you actually label, figures. Yes. So for figures, to differentiate them from tuples, this is obviously not a tuple, as you can see. It's now a figure because this is a picture. There are no rows and columns there. So for a figure now, all the labeling is underneath. And that has to recur, all the labeling is underneath, like the way I wrote. So you write figure 1.1 proposal, maybe it's no longer proposal items. It's now carrots. Let us assume maybe you are doing a research on agricultural crops, on crops, on agricultural things. And this picture of carrots came from a World Bank document, which was published in 2019. You label like that. So it means before you put the figure, you actually introduce it by a brief introduction. According to the World Bank, carrots have got these features as shown in the figure below. Instead of labeling the title of the figure, you show us straight away the figure, and then you label underneath, as shown in my specimen there. So I will delete that. So that's how we label figures and tuples. And figures and tuples, they can appear as part of your background information. Actually, it makes your background information, they make your background information richer and more credible than a student who is researching something which is factual, like interest rates or like economic growth. But we don't see any economic growth information. We don't see any interest rate information, which they've read from the literature. At the end of the day, we would be very doubtful as to whether this student really understands what they are researching. If your topic is quantitative and there is readily available secondary data that you can just summarize in a table, you don't need to put everything in a table to such an extent that you have got a table now that is so long that it breaks the flow of content. You just put brief tables. And then later on, when you are doing your literature review, that's when you can have longer tables, or when you are doing data analysis, you can just put very long tables in the appendix, and then you summarize the analysis of them in your chapter 4 there. So basically, just to summarize, in your background to the start, you give us background information about the phenomenon or the topic that you are investigating as a researcher or as a student. And you can have the background to the study has got no stipulated limit, but since this is a research proposal, the maximum length is normally 2 to 2.5 pages. When it is 2 pages, it's fine for undergraduate level requirements. And this enables you to stay focused so that in your background to the start, you don't drag in a lot of issues that don't really impinge on the core of what you are researching as a student. So that you stay focused, you just summarize the issues, and then you restrict yourself to, say, 2 pages at most. If there are tables and figures, obviously, it can go up to 2 pages. And again, we encourage students not to put in a lot of tables and figures there, because it makes the research proposal too long. Again, there will be literature review where you can, introduce these tables and figures when you are actually doing a thorough literature review in chapter 2. And then next, we move on to the statement of the problem. The reason why the background to the study is so important is because you distill the knowledge gap, what we call the knowledge gap, or the issues at hand that you want to investigate. They are distilled from the background to the start. So if the background to the start is speculative like this, then there is no knowledge gap to tell us, because the knowledge gap can only be deduced from the literature. We can only deduce a knowledge gap or something which has been pointed out in the research topic, or something which has been touched upon in the research topic, which is worth investigating. We can only see it if the student was referring to the literature. If our student or our researcher was not referring to the literature, and they start to cite the literature in the statement of the problem, then we've got a big problem. When they were speculating under the background to the study. Because if the background to the study has got no literature backing it, or any part of any discursive, narrative, interrogative, evaluative, analytical part of a research project, if it is not based on authors or based on the literature, we say it is speculative because the students just reasoning. Either they were actually plagiarizing information which they saw somewhere, and they decided not to acknowledge the authors that they were citing from, or the student was not plagiarizing, but the student is just got these grandiose ideas that they think they can be researched on, but they don't want to relate these grandiose ideas to the existing literature, what I call to the extant literature. In that case, we have got a big problem because the student can't prove any knowledge gap. We don't know where they are coming from. We don't know their point of departure or their point of convergence with the existing literature, or what they are adding to enrich the literature, or what they are contributing to extend the boundaries of knowledge. We won't be knowing. So the statement of the problem is actually a byproduct of the background to the study. A well-done background to the study, makes it very easy for the student to point out the knowledge gap or the problem which is worth researching. We know that in 2020, we started having this problem of COVID-19. And now, because the problem of COVID-19 is a fairly recent phenomenon, no one really knows how it affects the adoption of mobile banking products, how it impinges on customer satisfaction vis-a-vis mobile banking products. So a student might say, I want to investigate the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on customer satisfaction vis-a-vis mobile banking products. To have a short topic, they will say the impact of COVID-19 on mobile banking in Zimbabwe. And then they zero in on products and customer satisfaction issues when they are covering the background to the study. And then they review the previous literature, which was written before COVID-19. And then they point out that the gap here is that there is a fundamental fact that affected the whole world, which is likely to have an impact on mobile banking product adoption rates and, diffusion rates as well in the market. So we as researchers, or I as a researcher, I'm interested in knowing the linkages between, various facets or issues that impinge on mobile banking vis-a-vis the various aspects of the COVID-19 pandemic. So the student might be looking at issues to do with the death rates associated with COVID-19, the infection rates, the lockdowns that have been done, the levels of the lockdowns, the prevalence rate of the COVID-19 disease in different communities and how it impinged on the use of mobile banking products. Did it increase the use of mobile banking products? Did it reduce the use of mobile banking products? These are issues that they will be investigating. And then what they are bringing on the table is this this COVID-19 variable vis-a-vis mobile banking, which has always been existing. So that's what they are bringing in to bridge the knowledge gap. They point it out under the statement of the problem. So that can be generalized into other issues that the student will be investigating at any given time. After covering the statement of the problem, as you can see, it is just a brief. You are pointing out the knowledge gap. You may or may not refer to the literature. In most cases, if you have done a good job, a thorough job under the background to the study, you don't need to refer to the literature because you would have referred to the literature under the background to the start section. So next, you move on to research objectives. And the research objectives are properly calibrated as section 1.3. And you don't just go to the primary research objective, but you actually introduce the research objectives by telling us that the research objectives are subdivided into the primary and the secondary research objectives. And then here, the student made a mistake. Under the primary research objective, the student was supposed to write a full sentence. The main objective, or the main aim, or the aim, the main objective of this study is to investigate the scope and achievements of Zimbabwean, the scope and achievements of Zimbabwean banks within the context of the agricultural sector of the economy. So the main research objectives, the main research objective must be stated as a full sentence, like what I've just done to modify this research proposal, which was poorly done. The main objective of this study is to investigate the scope and achievements of Zimbabwean banks within the context of the agricultural sector of the economy. Or, alternatively, you can say the aim, because a main objective is an aim. The aim of this study is to, you can say, is to analyze. Instead of saying the scope and achievements, you can say is to analyze the impact of Zimbabwean banks. You change the objective completely, depending on what you actually want to do. To analyze the impact of Zimbabwean banks on the performance of the agricultural sector. You put a full stop. Is to analyze. That may be your main aim, to analyze. Other students, their main aim might be to evaluate, which obviously at a certain point will involve analysis. Once you have stated your main objective, then because it's a broad thing, it has to be broken down into sub-objectives. And then there must be a topic sentence then. There must be a topic sentence under 1.3.2. Things indenting inwards. Just to correct that. Yes. So the student might say the secondary objectives of the study are, put a colon. They always start with two. So this would be our number 1. 2. Again, here we have to restart from number 1, like what I've just done. There must be a topic sentence which is like that. You don't just state things which are not anchored by a full sentence. The secondary objectives of the start are to identify, to analyze. It can't be identifying everyone. To analyze, to suggest, you don't off, to suggest solutions to the identified problems. For instance, you might have completely different objectives. It might be to identify, to analyze, to evaluate, to demonstrate, to compare and contrast, to do all sorts of things. And then straight away you move to your research questions, which is section 1.4. And the research questions are just a mirror reflection of your research objectives, with the first research question mirroring your primary research objective. Is it clear? So the first research question has to mirror the primary research objective. So for instance, in our case, the first research question, instead of being what it is there, it will be, what is the impact of Zimbabwean banks on the performance of the agricultural sector? Or you can have your research question being, how do Zimbabwean banks impact the performance of the agricultural sector, for instance? Or to what extent does the performance of Zimbabwean banks, to what extent does the performance of Zimbabwean banks affect the viability of the agricultural sector in Zimbabwe? So you can have so many ways of, crafting your questions based on the primary research objective. That's the opening research question. And then the second research question will be based on the secondary research objective. The third research question will be based on the second research objective. The fourth research question will be based on the third research objective, and so on. In general, we don't encourage students to have many secondary research objectives because the study becomes just too broad. And it will tend to lack focus because the student will start to drag in a lot of issues which are not really focused on the core of the study. We normally encourage students to have at most 4 secondary research objectives. In this case, if you look at this student, he had 3 secondary research objectives that were anchoring 1 primary research objective. So the fewer the research objectives, the more focused the study. Because in some universities, when a student is pursuing, say, an MPhil or a PhD, let us assume a student is pursuing a Master of Philosophy in banking or in investment management, for instance. Each research question or research objective will then be crafted into a research topic for a student at a lower level. If you are doing an MPhil, your first, second research objective will form a topic for a certain undergraduate student. Your second research objective, second topic for another undergraduate student. Just imagine if you have got 5 secondary research objectives. It means you have got 5 students that you are co-supervising with your main supervisor who is supervising your MPhil. It means you become confused because those students, they will then come up with their sub-objectives. Do you realize? So we always encourage students to have at most 4. They can be 5 under exceptional circumstances, where there are a lot of interrelated issues that can't be covered in one research objective. Because again, students are normally discouraged from crafting double-barreled research objectives. What is a double-barreled research objective? It is a research objective which captures two things within itself. We always encourage the student to split the different issues into different research objectives, secondary research objectives. So if the issues are many, but those many issues, they can't be covered exhaustively in fewer research objectives, a student can overlap to 5, say, secondary research objectives. But in the ordinary run of things, we encourage our students to have at least, at most 4, under exceptional circumstances, 5 secondary research objectives. Because if the secondary research objectives are 4, it means the student will have by corollary 5 research questions. If there are 6 secondary research objectives, the research questions will become 7, because the first research question will have to mirror your primary research objective. And then once we are done with the research questions, which are actually interrogating your research objectives, they are not a standalone feature, but they are an offshoot or an interrogation of your research objectives. Next, we move on to the hypothesis of the study, which is your section 1.5. The hypothesis of the study has to be introduced. It must be introduced. This study is based on 2 main hypotheses. If there are many now, the I will be substituted by the E in between the 2 S's. But if it is one main hypothesis, it will be SIS. 2 or more hypotheses, it will be SES, the spelling. You have to take note of the spelling. And then if the hypotheses are 2 like this, it's either they are clearly sublabeled. You can have 1.5.1. It's not wrong. The first research hypothesis. 1.5.2, the second research hypothesis. Now, one thing which I need to point out, this student made a mistake. The null hypothesis is always a negation. It is always a negation. What do I mean when I say the null hypothesis is always a negation? The word null from set theory, it means 0. It means 0. The word null, it means 0. Null means 0 or empty, or does not exist, or does not exist, or non-existent, non-existent, and so on. It means 0 or empty or does not exist or non-existent. So since the word null means something does not exist, it means what we call a null hypothesis, your H0, which is your null hypothesis, always has to have a negation of something, so that that something does not exist. Are we clear? It will always be a negation of something which is actually held to exist. For instance, here the null hypothesis, the proper null hypothesis is that the banking industry has not played an important role in the agricultural sector. In other words, what we are simply saying is that the impact of the banking industry on the agricultural sector is 0. The banking industry has got no impact in the agricultural sector. So the null, and then we have got the alternative hypothesis. The alternative hypothesis. The alternative hypothesis. The alternative hypothesis always opposes the null hypothesis. And the alternative hypothesis may be just summative. In other words, it may summarize in its negation of the null hypothesis by saying the banking industry has played an important role in the agricultural sector. Or it may be actually more analytic. If it is more analytic, instead of using, an all-encompassing word like an important role, it might start by saying a positive role in the agricultural development, full stop. And then we have alternative hypothesis number 2. If we didn't think of summarizing, we have alternative hypothesis number 2. And then we just tweak the first, the first statement then under the alternative hypothesis. Instead of saying the banking industry has played a positive role in the agricultural sector, some might say, but maybe it destabilized the agricultural sector if banks collapsed and farmers were not able to access loans and they were not able to plan for the future despite the good rains. They were not able to put land under crop, and thus it destabilized someone might say it had a negative role in agricultural development in Zimbabwe. I'm not saying banking has a negative role, but from a theoretical perspective, you can come up with an alternative hypothesis like that, in which case it will be hypothesis number 2. Alternative 1, which is saying positive. Alternative 2, which is saying negative. You can have so many permutations depending on what you're investigating. In some instances, to negate a certain null hypothesis, you may have up to 5 or 6 permutations, 5 or 6 possibilities. Here, I can only think of 2 possibilities. The first possibility is that it played a positive role. The second possibility is that it played a negative role. Someone who has got a fertile mind might say, it played both a positive and a negative role. Someone who says, it played both roles. It didn't just play one role to the exclusion of the other role. It will be alternative hypothesis number 3 now, which says, no, the banking industry had both a positive and a negative impact on the agricultural sector in Zimbabwe. Do you realize? So the alternative hypothesis does not always need to be one. There can be so many of them, but the null hypothesis is always one. And it is always a negation, because the word null means 0, it means empty, it means does not exist, it means non-existent. So we're always negating a certain phenomenon. So going back now, I will leave the other things as they are for you to digest when you are looking at the notes later on. Going to hypothesis number 2, the null hypothesis. And by the way, you can either label using symbols, this H with a subscript 0 and H with a subscript 1, H with a subscript 2, whatever the case may be. If you use the symbols, you don't need to write null hypothesis, alternative hypothesis, and like that. If you choose to use words, you dispense with the symbols. If you really want to use both, then the symbols are either hyphenated away from the words or they are in brackets, or they are put in brackets. And then hypothesis number 2, it's now bearing on loans, total loans from commercial banks to the agricultural sector, that there is no significant relationship between the issuing of loans to the agricultural sector and the output of the agricultural sector. And then the alternative is negating that. It can negate that by saying positive, negative, both positive and negative, like what I've just done, or just by summarizing to avoid being unnecessarily, too pedantic, if I may put it that way. And then next, ladies and gentlemen, we move on to the assumptions of the start. The assumptions of the start. The assumptions of the start may be stated in a paragraph, but I normally prefer students just listing them. You don't need to go to town in your statement of assumptions to the start. You can either use, a paragraph where you feel you have to explain briefly each and every assumption. You may assume that COVID-19 has got no impact on the agricultural sector. It's an assumption. You are not saying it has got no impact. You are just assuming. It's like when at this Zoom lecture, I assumed that the internet will hold until I've finished the lecture. It's an assumption. I assumed that students would log on and one student logged on. Other students, for one reason or another, are not able to log on in real time. It's an assumption. I assumed that my computer would not crash as I'm presenting. It's an assumption. It's like a person who goes to the kitchen when they are hungry. The assumption will be that no one will finish all the food in the kitchen, that the food is available, that electricity is available to warm the food. All of those are assumptions. That utensils, at least there are some utensils that are clean for the person to eat their food. That the table has not been borrowed by the neighbors, for instance. That the cutlery has not been borrowed by some people for a party. These are assumptions that we make on a daily basis. It's the same with the research. When you are undertaking a research, there's so many assumptions that will be flying in your mind. We want you as the student to capture the main assumptions that underpin your study. For most of you, if not all of you, I would want you to actually make an assumption on COVID-19. Because if you don't make assumptions about COVID-19, you will discover that it will start to affect how you are researching. And then how will you deal with that COVID-19 when it is impinging on your research? You must make certain assumptions. Whether that assumption is unrealistic or realistic, it's another story. But assumptions, they don't need, you don't need to cite authors on assumptions. We make assumptions all the time. When I get into the car and drive to town, I'm assuming that the road has not been wiped away by a flood. I'm assuming that a bridge on my way to town has not collapsed. That's why I'll be driving maybe at 80 or 90 kilometers per hour. Just imagine I'm driving at 90 kilometers per hour only to discover that the bridge has collapsed. There are no cars that are moving. It means my assumption was wrong. So the assumptions that we make, they may be either factually correct or factually wrong. But still there are assumptions that propel us to do certain things. So you state your assumptions. And because you are aware that your assumptions may be wrong, they may not conform to what is prevailing in reality. Straight away in 1.7, you have to state the limitations of your study, which sort of moderates what you are assuming. Limitations of your study, the time period is usually a limiting thing. You can't investigate a phenomenon and then you cover all of time. First, you don't have the resources to gather information for all of time. Secondly, you may not have all the time to cover all of time, because here you are undertaking a study to fulfill the requirements of your degree. And you have got a few months to start and complete the study. So it's a limitation. Some limitations are of a financial nature. You don't have all the money that you would need to really investigate the phenomenon on the ground, or to do all the phone calls that you need to do, or to buy all the relevant data that is needed to analyze your phenomenon. Or another limitation may be that as a student, you may lack the requisite expertise to understand all the issues that impinge on the phenomenon that you are studying, and so on and so forth. So you just spell out the limitations. Again, you may list the limitations, or you may present them in a paragraph, like what that young man decided to do. And then the scope of the study, in this instance, it was poorly done. The scope of the study has to be longer than what you are seeing there in the specimen under our 1.8, because the scope must be delimited at many levels. If your study is a time series study, in other words, you are looking at the relationship between interest rates and agricultural output. We know that the relationship between interest rates and agricultural output can't be cross-sectional. You can't take a snapshot of interest rates and agricultural output at a specific point in time and get a meaningful relationship. You have to have a schedule a list of interest rate figures, which is a list over time, which means you are using longitudinal information. And then you have a list of your agricultural output information of various crops, and then the summary or the index, which is summarizing for the whole agricultural sector. And then, so it means you delimit the scope in terms of time, and you justify why you are deleting the scope in terms of that time. You delimit the scope in terms of the issues that are covered. Because when you're investigating a particular phenomenon, it's impossible to cover all the issues which impinge on that phenomenon. For instance, your main issue might be agricultural output. But in agriculture, they produce so many things. They produce flowers. Agriculture includes horticulture. It includes market gardening. It includes production of so many other things. You can't cover everything which can be covered within the agricultural sector. One, it's not practical to include everything which is produced in the agricultural sector. You might decide, I will zero in on tobacco, I will zero in on cotton, I will zero in on maize, I will zero in on groundnuts, I'll zero in on this product, I'll zero in on small livestock, I'll zero in on cattle, and so on and so forth. Are we clear? So you have to delimit the specific issues that you will actually zero in on as a research, so that your study remains focused. If you don't delimit the conceptual issues that are covered in your study, you will lead me as a reader or as an examiner or as a supervisor to expect anything that I can think of when I look at your research topic. And then I will start to trouble you in when you are doing chapter 2, saying, why didn't you cover this issue? The main problem will be emanating from a scope of the study which is not properly delimited. So in the scope of the study, you are sort of managing our expectations as readers, as examiners, as supervisors, by telling us the issues that, look, Dr. Ian Indlovu, I'm covering A, B, C, D. I'm not moving to E. E is outside it's outside the scope of this study. And then there are some studies where a student will use a case study of a bank, or a case study of banks that are found in a particular town, operating in a particular town or province. That is the geographical scope. Time scope, conceptual issues scope, and geographical scope. Once more, time or duration scope, conceptual issues scope, geographical delimitation of the study. Where possible and where you can justify why you are delimiting the scope like that, you can justify either in terms of the literature or in terms of practical considerations. Like, you know, the fact that time is limited, it may affect how much area you cover. You can't cover all of Zimbabwe when you are doing your research over 4 months. You can only cover all of Zimbabwe if you are doing a research over 4 months, provided you are using secondary data, in which case the data will be readily available. And what you are just doing, your intervention in the literature is to just analyze existing information. Then your geographical scope may be all of Zimbabwe. And you may cover maybe, you know, from 1970 up to 30, because your information is readily available. But if you are going to gather primary data, then you will be encumbered by, you know, time, resource, technical and other constraints from gathering the data on the ground, as well as COVID-19 with its various restrictions. And then after you are done with the scope of the study, you move on to 1.9, which is the justification of the study. The justification of the study. Under the justification of the study, you tell us the hope. What do you hope to contribute with your study when it is finished? It is the hope of this study. It is the hope of the researcher, or it is the hope of this study that when, you know, when we have linked or when we have analyzed the relationship between total loans issued and agricultural output, the agricultural sector and the banking sector will be able to help each other by the provision of tailor-made products that are sensitive to the needs of the agricultural sector. farmers will be in a position to know the conditions that exist in the banking sector. It is the hope of this study that policymakers will be informed by the projected or the expected findings from this study and the policy recommendations. It is the hope of this study that multilateral institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, SADC, African Union, and so on, ECOWAS, the European Union, they may benefit from the findings of this study. It is the hope of this study that foreign missions like embassies are likely to benefit from the insights that will be obtained in undertaking this study, and so on and so forth. And then the last part of the significance of the study, it has to cover, it has to justify your study in terms of your degree requirements, that this study is being undertaken to fulfill the partial requirements for the Bachelor of Commerce in Banking and Investment Management honors degree. You must not forget that. Because the reason why this study is justified is because it's a requirement for you to complete your degree. So it has to be stated at the end or at the beginning. Somewhere it must be stated that this is a requirement. This study will help the researcher to fulfill the requirements of the Bachelor of Commerce in Banking and Investment Management honors degree. You are done with your justification of the study. Some, they call the justification of the study the significance of the study. It still means the same thing. You are telling us why your study, you feel your study is important to you and to others. And then after you have written on the, and this significance or justification of the study, instead of it being just one unwieldy paragraph like this, you can actually paragraph different components, but it should not be too long. It can be 3/4 of a page or so. It's fine. You are done at most. And then you move on to a brief literature review. Here, the brief literature review was poorly done as well. Immediately after writing 1.10.0, the student was supposed to introduce this section of brief literature review. That this section of brief literature review, or this section, comprises of, they cover the issues that they actually cover in the brief literature review. In their case, they only cover two components, which is the theoretical or conceptual part and the empirical evidence. And then after doing that, that's the first way of introducing the brief literature review. The second way of introducing the brief literature review is to capture briefly the theory or theories that are actually covered in your research topic, or that impinge on your research topic, or that impinge on the phenomenon that you are investigating. The theoretical issues, the empirical issues, they will then be covered as an answer to those theoretical issues. Or you just tell us the sections that are covered, and then you move on to 1.10.1. Always your literature review, as you are going to see when you are doing literature review proper, it starts with the theoretical part, and then it ends with the empirical evidence part. So you'll have the theoretical part, which is very brief. Again, this was poorly done because it's one long paragraph, which ends up being meaningless. So it has to be properly paragraphed. Different ideas must exist in different paragraphs. Let us assume in this area, the student has started a new idea where they say, according to so and so, it will be a paragraph under the conceptual framework or under the theoretical framework. And then they move on to empirical evidence. Again, it is too unwieldy, it's too long. Let us assume here the student is starting a new idea, it's just an assumption. It will be a second paragraph. And then they conclude with a concluding sentence. And then next we move on to 1.11.0, which is your research methodology, which has to be introduced again in terms of the main issues that are covered under the research methodology section. So your 1.11.1 has to be the research design. instead of the student waffling and telling us stories about what a research design is, the student must actually tell us the design that they propose to implement in their study. Many students, they then start to write notes for us. We are not interested in notes. We have got gigabytes of notes on research methodology. We don't want any more notes. So if the student is telling us that they used an experimental design, for instance, or a survey design, they then justify it in terms of previous researchers. That's when you can cite authors to avoid writing notes. This study proposes to adopt a survey design because the phenomenon being investigated is 13 banks. Obviously, you can't investigate 13 banks using the case study approach. There are too many to be a case study. You can't call them a case study when there are 13. If there are 3, you can call them a case study of 3 banks. But the moment there are many, it's no longer a case study, it's now a survey. Now, if the student wants to undertake an econometric study where they are looking at the impact of commercial bank loans on agricultural output, obviously the study, it might be, mixed. The research design might be mixed. A case study of the Commercial Bank of Zimbabwe, which is CPZ. But now, because you are going to do a statistical or an econometric study, the student might say, this case study is underpinned by an experimental design. Why experimental design? Because the student will take, statistical information on different kinds of bank loans that were issued by this commercial bank, CPZ, and then look at agricultural output of the entities that were given these loans by CPZ or by the Commercial Bank of Zimbabwe. You see. So when they do this statistical analysis, it's like they are doing an experiment using various model formulations. They are doing an experiment. And then once the student has presented to us the research design that they want to implement, and they've justified that research design in terms of the phenomenon that they're investigating and also in terms of the literature. It's very important. In terms of the literature, the student will then move on to the population of study, where they tell us, instead of telling us what a population of study is, which is nonsensical or unnecessary, they tell us the actual population. There are 10 banks that we're investigating with an unknown number of customers, but which customers are definitely more than 100. You see. So, and the sample will comprise of 120 individuals who will be interviewed using phone interviews by the student. Now with COVID, you may use SurveyMonkey or other platforms, or even Facebook or email, in order to target your potential respondents. You tell us the target respondents under the delimitation of the sampling frame. Immediately after the population of study has been spelled out, the student will go to the sampling frame and sampling techniques. Under the sampling frame and sampling techniques, you choose the sampling methods and you justify them. You justify the sampling methods as per whatever you are going to be investigating. And this part is redundant for students who use secondary data because the data has already been gathered. You don't need to tell us about how it was sampled. And the sampling frame of secondary data, we don't need it because it is there in the literature. So if you are using secondary data, you are looking at investment and economic growth. This section is redundant for a student. Instead of this section, you go straight to your model formulation. You identify your variables. You go to this research proposal was actually crafted by a student who was gathering primary data, which is why it is like this. For a student gathering, doing a secondary data-based kind of study, there is a model which will be actually formulated with this different kind of sections, you see. So, but assuming our student is looking at, is gathering primary data, and it's a qualitative study, then there is a sampling frame and sampling techniques as inspired or instructed by the literature. And then we go to data sources. And then we go to secondary data. Because all studies, even if you are gathering primary data, they have to have secondary data. So you spell out the main examples of secondary data, the bulletins and the journals that anchor your study, including the internet as well. And then the last part will be the data analysis and presentation plan. The data analysis and presentation plan. You cover that. And then after you have covered the data analysis and presentation plan, after you have covered that part, you must have a time budget for the research proposal. The time budget basically is like your program of how you hope to do the from start to completion. For instance, with you, the final draft is supposed to be submitted maybe by end of July. So we can say there mid-July. Mid-July. And then there, we can still say here we can say early July. Early July. There we can say mid-July. Mid-July. We can say mid-July. And then the final draft is just an example. I don't know when you are going to submit the final draft. We say end of July, which is 31 July 2022. That's your Gantt chart. It's called the time budget or a Gantt chart. Or a Gantt chart. The time budget or a Gantt chart. And then after this, you have the list of references. And because this list of references was poorly done, I've got my own list of references that I'm going to share. So I'm going to stop sharing this screen and look for my list of references. So I'm going to present my list of references. I'm going to share them as a screen so that you see the properly crafted list of references. This is a specimen list of references. This is how we expect you to do your list of references according to the augmented, Harvard reference system. So I won't dwell much on this. There might be a separate video that I'll do on how you craft your reference list. But what I'm going to do for purposes of you producing a meaningful proposal, I'm going to send you this specimen reference list to guide you. So I believe I am done with what I wanted to present today. And I believe that you have benefited. So since there's just the two of you, and I was recording this session, I'm now going to end the recording. As soon as I finish this recording, I'm going to upload it and share with you. In our group, in the group that we created, I'm going to share with you this session that we just covered. I'm going to convert this video and then upload it online on my YouTube channel so that at least you can benefit and you can refer back when you are crafting your research proposal. I believe you have benefited from this session. We will have more sessions where I will be covering different aspects of research because I don't want surprises from my colleague, the students that I will be supervising. So thank you so much for your time. Have a nice day.